Hello, welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Jane Dutton. In recent days, much of the focus has been about what to do with Syria's chemical weapons. But on the ground, the civil war is showing no signs of easing, and fighting remains as fierce as ever. Neither the opposition nor the government is strong enough to tip the balance in the conflict. A conflict that has gone on for more than 2 years and killed at least 100,000 people. And yet any resolution is still hindered by the lack of consensus between major world powers that back opposing sides in the fighting. But as KRISTEN SALOOMEY reports now, there are calls for more diplomatic action.
With neither side gaining ground in Syria's 2-year-old war and infighting among the opposition, the one thing all sides seem to agree on is the need for diplomacy. One of Syria's deputy prime ministers said stopping foreign intervention should be the first step.
What does matter now is Geneva's schedule. What will Geneva do? For the violence to be halted, external intervention must be stopped. Therefore, the sequence should be like this: preventing external intervention, stopping the violence, and then launching a political process.
French President François Hollande hopes Iran can help broker a deal.
And in Syria, we are trying to find a political solution, because only a political solution will bring an end to what is the greatest massacre of the 21st century.
But diplomacy moves slowly. Syria has now handed over a complete list of its chemical weapons sites to the chemical weapons watchdog, the OPCW. The United States is cautious.
I don't want to get ahead of it, but we have a document now that we didn't have yesterday.
The disclosure was required under the agreement between U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov as the first stage of eliminating Syria's stockpiles.
The permanent 5 members of the Security Council have been meeting almost daily here at the United Nations to hammer out the agreement for dismantling Syria's chemical weapons. But they need the OPCW to agree to the plan in principle first before they can put it to a vote.
The OPCW postponed a meeting on the plan that had been set for Sunday, pushing back a possible Security Council vote indefinitely.
KRISTEN SALOOMEY for Inside Syria,
the United Nations.
Well, it is very difficult to get an accurate picture of what's going on, but when finding political solutions and starting peace talks, is that completely detached from the reality on the ground, or are opposition fighters watching and reacting to political developments? To discuss this, we are joined by our 3 guests. In Washington, D.C., Therese, an independent journalist, writer and producer. She's just come back from Syria after spending the last 2 years covering the conflict. In Providence, Rhode Island, Elias Muhanna, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Middle East Studies at Brown University. And here in the studio in Doha, we are joined by Saleh Mubarak, a member of the Syrian National Council and a professor at Qatar University. Welcome, all 3 of you. Thank you very much for taking the time out to talk to us. Saleh, let's talk about the political maneuvers underway at the moment. Iran has now extended a gesture to get involved in this, and yet I believe the SNC finds this unacceptable. Why is that?
All right, well, good evening to everyone. The Iranian president has the image of a moderate, a reformer, Mr. Hassan Rouhani. However, we have 2 problems with his proposition. Number 1, he is not the final authority. It's Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the supreme leader there, has the final say, and the supreme leader has not been replaced or has not changed in the past 2 years. So basically the policy in Iran cannot change much with the change of the president. That's number 1. Number 2, we would answer him to Mr. Rouhani himself, the president, that we appreciate your offer very much, but before you can mediate, you have to be neutral. In order to be neutral, you have to pull your forces, stop sending weapons, military experts, and those militias that you're supporting in Syria. Once you stop that, you can qualify to be a moderator or a mediator.
Saleh, is the SNC in any position to reject these overtures, regardless from where they come? Why is it being so uncompromising? Does it represent what Syrians who are caught up in the fighting want?
Well, first, minor correction, it's the coalition, not the SNC. The SNC is part of the coalition, but the coalition is the one. I agree with you, but we have a proverb in Syria and in the Arab world that says the letter is clear from its title, from its address. And when we see something that is clearly not leading us there, it's a waste of time. We don't want to give them the opportunity, because basically we see the other side buying time. All these initiatives and so on. The regime seems to be accepting at the beginning and then stalling and then making inquiries and all kind of things, only to buy time. In the meantime, people are getting killed. We're open for any serious initiative. And even Mr. Rouhani, I was actually discussing this yesterday with my colleagues. What's wrong in accepting, but at the same time, we need some kind of good, to show us that he's serious and he has goodwill. Iran is one of the two major allies. In fact, it is the major ally of the Syrian regime. So they have to show some neutrality.
Let me put that to Elias, if I may. What do you make about Rouhani's gesture? I mean, he certainly seems to have possibly a more peaceful agenda than his predecessor at this stage. Is this something that's worth looking at? And will Syrians who not necessarily part of the fighting or politics be open to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you don't go to the dialogue table with the sponsors that you want. You go to the dialogue table with the sponsors that you have, and to wait and say that, we expect them to withdraw arms and withdraw support before we can even begin to discuss compromises. I think it's a naive and idealistic objective. I think that we have to realize that although the chances for a political compromise in this context are still extremely low, given the huge obstacles actually on both sides, we also should not be so blindsided by the fact that this actually does constitute a real breakthrough, a real possibility for the basis for a political solution in Syria. So, and these kinds of opportunities are very few and far between. This is a moment that the principal combatants, or people who actually believe in a political solution, and it seems these days everybody says they're in favor of a political solution. This is an opportunity that should be seized.
Anna, you seem to be agreeing with what Elias said. I know you've spent several years in Syria. You spent a lot of time talking to some of the fighters who are there fighting the Assad regime. Do you think, knowing what sort of role Iran plays on the ground, that Iran could be a good mediator here?
I understand the cynicism coming out of the SNC and the coalition, because it would be the same thing as the Gulf or the United States and different bodies that are supporting the opposition coming out and saying they want to be chief negotiators. There's a lot of mistrust that has been building over the past 2 years. At the same time, we have seen breakthroughs in the political discourse in the past week that need to be acknowledged, and the fact that we are moving towards UN Week starting this Sunday. This is an opportunity for diplomatic solutions, and again, as we have stated commitments to a political solution, now is the moment to seize on that so we can start to see positive moves on the ground. People are cynical about a ceasefire and other political solutions that are going to need to follow the ceasefire. This undoubtedly will be a long, maybe multi-year process. However, it begins with a ceasefire that is only possible when we bring everyone to the table.
Elias, do you think that Assad is playing the better game here? He said, look, I'll give you the information about my chemical weapons. I will go to Geneva without any preconditions. Is he playing the more conciliatory role here?
This regime is known for being master tacticians as far as avoiding the bargaining table, avoiding dialogue. So one should not underestimate the Syrian government's ability to kind of play the diplomatic game as a kind of cat and mouse game. So I think that, but at the same time, we have to recognize that there are very few opportunities to actually begin a process. And I think that if Geneva can bring about at the very least a ceasefire and the beginning of a framework for either de facto partition of the country, at least in terms of security zones, and starting to talk about humanitarian corridors, that is the basis for any kind of hope for a situation where the most radical groups, whether they're Shabiha militiamen on one side or the Jabhat al-Nusra types on the other side, begin to have less ability to operate, and we can empower the more moderate elements and the more moderate voices within this conflict.
Well, let's look at some of the challenges the SNC faces. The opposition has been criticised for failing to unite. And back in March, the SNC was on the verge of collapse after its president, Ahmed Muaz al-Khatib, offered his resignation only days before representing the coalition in the Arab League summit in Doha. Meanwhile, analysts say the Syrian National Coalition has to become a unified opposition movement that achieves 4 critical and linked goals, including coordinating internal military action with the Free Syrian Army and working on transforming it into a national army with a high degree of discipline and combat readiness, generating legitimate and credible local governance bodies in areas liberated from government control, getting the support of minority groups, including Alawites, Kurds, Druze and Christians, and also protecting their safety in any post-Assad Syria. And finally, managing the rising flow of international diplomacy and aid. You who knows the SNC better than any of us, Saleh, how close are they to achieving any of those goals, which will make it obviously a more important player, a more credible player?
Okay, you know, first of all, that they have elected a temporary prime minister, Dr. Ahmed Ta'mi, I think last week. And he has a good credibility on ground and outside. And basically his government will focus on public service to the liberated areas. They will provide as much as possible food, shelter, medicine, and education. Then the foreign affairs and military affairs will be dealt with by the leadership of the coalition. There is now a high coordination, and I've heard also reports from my colleagues that there's more funding now coming. Maybe you can say as reconciliation after that military strike was ruled out or was decided against, and they're getting more money, which helps them go to, you know, more power on the ground. Let me explain one quick thing that maybe you know, your guest can verify who was inside Syria. Many of the fighters of those radical groups, namely the ISL, the Islamic State in Iraq and Sham, and Jabhat al-Nusra, many of the fighters themselves are not so radical, but they wanted to join a group that is well organized, well funded, and has weapons. So those were in particular, Jabhat al-Nusra was the only option to them, because there was no sufficient funding to the other brigades.
Because of course the FSA, who the SNC is aligned to, has joined ranks with al-Nusra. They've come to some sort of agreement.
Right, right. And keep in mind that people inside do not care about the classification of terrorist groups by the US or the West. They care about mainly 2 things. Is whoever taking care of us, providing food, shelter, and so on. Number 2, are they interfering in our daily life, you know, because our people are moderate. They don't want people, you know, anyone to force any system on them, whether it's Islamic or otherwise. So we had problems, yes, with those groups because they want to force a sort of Talibanic rule over people, and people don't like that.
Okay, let me put that.
You know, one major reason for their strength is that they had the funding. The other groups of the FSA did not have funding, and that's why fighters have joined them.
And is that what you found? Is what Saleh saying, is that correct? That it's better to align the FSA, to align themselves with this group and fight with them than having them on the outside, possibly?
One thing that I would echo is the fact that these groups have been much better funded, and thus you do have more moderate, pluralist Syrians that have aligned with them in order to be part of a winning team. So one other thing that I would add is that, for example, we've already seen this week that ISIS, one of the groups he spoke of, which is an al-Qaeda affiliated group, took a major border crossing. There were Syrian protests against this group saying, you know, we welcomed you as guests. You were supposed to help us. You know, how dare you at this point, you know, take over and impose foreign rule on us? So we do see even opposition to these kinds of groups from Syrians, even in a point where
Syrian civilians are very... These groups have been described as al-Qaeda-linked groups who have al-Qaeda aspirations.
Yes, there are two groups that have al-Qaeda links to al-Qaeda, which Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Shams. And the difference between the two is Jabhat al-Nusra has really focused on Syria and making this struggle against Bashar al-Assad, while the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Shams has a more transnational look. And that is where the Syrian people began to protest them this past week, is because they said, you know, you came in, you can't impose an agenda on us when we have been fighting for 2 years in a very brutal struggle.
Now, I read, excuse me, jumping in here, sorry, some of your writings, dining with Syria's al-Qaeda, which I enjoyed very much, by the way. But those fighters who you met, you were saying you had a lot in common with them. They were very well educated. They spoke a lot about the US. While they want weapons from the US, would they be happy if the US were to conduct some sort of limited strike, if we were ever to get to that point?
The discourse has changed over the recent months. I think there's been an acceleration of mistrust among these groups. I think they're starting to get more fearful because of the disparate discourse here in the United States. You have McCain and other prominent Republicans leaders saying that there is a possibility of boots on the ground. That is something that these groups are unequivocally opposed to. They would see that as an occupation. They see this as something that they would respond with an insurgency. So that kind of discourse coming from the Republican government, Republican factions in the United States, they're not ignoring that. So Obama and Kerry can speak about surgical operations, but they do have to coordinate with the Republican forces in the United States, who are for arming different groups and also for boots on the ground in some situations. So this is where these groups are very skeptical of U.S. involvement. And again, because 100,000 Syrians have been killed, they see that American involvement now as something that they're very cynical about, skeptical, and very suspicious of.
All right, let's talk a little bit more about those groups. Al-Nusra Front. In April, the head of the religious armed group in Syria pledged his allegiance to al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. Al-Nusra was established in January last year. Its members used car bombs and suicide attacks in an attempt to bring down the Assad government. It has around 6,000 fighters and is believed to be largely funded and trained by al-Qaeda in Iraq. The group is responsible for hundreds of attacks and the deaths of countless civilians. In December, the US State Department put al-Nusra on its list of terrorist organizations. There is another important player here, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant or Shams. The group was established as an umbrella organization of Iraqi fighters in October 2006 under the name of Islamic State of Iraq. It's responsible for the deaths of thousands of Iraqi civilians as well as members of the Iraqi government. By late last year, the group was said to have grown in strength and more than doubled its members to about 2,500. And in April this year, it changed its name to the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant and became deeply involved in the Syrian conflict. Elias, the Syrian Deputy Prime Minister said that stopping foreign fighters is the priority here. I mean, again, this is the Syrian regime playing a clever card, because Bashar al-Assad has claimed all along that there are these fighters fighting against his regime, these international terrorists, and obviously he's raising one of the US's biggest fears.
That's right. Actually, that's been the discourse all along. Actually, from the very beginning, he practically called the teenagers who sprayed graffiti on the walls in Dir'a at the beginning of the uprising terrorists. This has been the kind of you're either with us or against us logic from the Assad regime from the very beginning of this conflict, and has basically tried to send the signal to the West and to Israel as well that if I go, then you're basically facing this rising tide of fundamentalist Sunni Muslims who don't tolerate the idea of a multi-sectarian, multi-confessional region. So this is very much the strategy that we've seen.
Saleh, do you think he is playing a very clever game here, outsmarting the West, drip-feeding the information about chemical weapons and the possibility, this is Assad, that it might fall into the wrong hands? Do you think the SNC and the West have been outsmarted?
Maybe, maybe not, but remember that the Syrian regime is flying with two wings, Iran and Russia. Without the Russian diplomatic support, things would have been much different. Not only diplomatic, but the Russians keep pumping weapons and all kind of help to the Syrian regime. Iran on the other side is providing them with fighters and so on. So I don't think it's a matter of Assad being smart. Assad is appealing to everyone. Assad appeals to the left wing that I'm the fortress of resistance against imperialism, then appeals to the headquarters of imperialism, the USA, that I'm the guardian against Islamic fundamentalism and so on. He talks to Iran as an Islamic figure, and then he talks to others, the fortress of secularism. He mentioned that we are the last fortress of secularism. So he's trying to please everyone just to stay in power. He would do anything. Now with the chemical weapons, which he previously said those are for the balance of power with Israel. They call them the nukes of the poor man's nukes, that we can't have nuclear weapons, and Israel does. So we have to balance that with those chemical weapons. Now we're asking them, you're giving them up for what? Israel is not giving up anything. Why are you giving up the chemical weapons? And the true answer is to stay in power. He would do anything to stay in power.
Anna, I'm going to throw some of your words back to you. Somebody you interviewed in one of your articles said that if the US cared about the Syrian people, they would have done something before 100,000 Syrians were killed. Does this also apply to the international community? Because even if there is some sort of resolution when it comes to chemical weapons, it's not going to stop the killing, is it?
No, certainly. For me, the civilian story of Syria is a story of repeated violation. It's the story of families whose homes were destroyed by a government they may have even been in support of. There was collective punishment of communities that had rebels in them, and there are refugees who were in support of the government, and then their homes, their children's schools, their places of work were bombed. So you have this story of, first, a violation by their own government, and then secondly, the violation of the indignities of the refugee camps and the IDP camps inside Syria. The situation without electricity, water, basic sanitation is unspeakable. So really that is a failure of the international community to help and fulfill their obligation to civilians in a time of war.
Elias, what do you think is likely to happen next?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between short-term, medium-term, long-term. I mean, Syria is an international problem. It's going to require an international solution. I think that many people have not quite gotten their minds around the immensity of the crime that took place in Ghouta. I mean, if it is true, and it looks increasingly true, almost certain, that the regime deployed chemical weapons in a neighborhood that killed 1,500 civilians, that's about the same number of people that were killed in the July 2006 war between Lebanon and Israel. We're living with the legacy of that war today. That's about half as many people who were killed in the Sabra and Shatila massacres in the Lebanese Civil War in 1982. 30 years later, we're living with that legacy. So I think it's important to focus on the short term, to focus on Geneva, to focus on getting a ceasefire at the very least. But we're looking at a very, very long, slow emergence from this terrible conflict, and I think that the people who have the ability to bring sides to the table need to bear that in mind.
And thank you very much to my guests in Washington, D.C., Anna Teresa Day, in Providence, Rhode Island, Elias Muhanna, and here in the studio, Saleh Mubarak. That's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria, not just on this program, but with our hourly news programs and, of course, online at aljazeera.com. I'm Jane Dutton. Thanks very much for watching.